Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, yWhales, wherever you are in the world. We have not really an NFT project today. It's a full metaverse project, and it's coming very, very, very soon. And it's a really big one. So we're very excited to have Dan Nissanoff here today with us. And I got Mr. Demetrio. I screwed up that name. How do you pronounce your last name, Mike?
Demetrio.
Demetrio. You got Mike Demetrio with me today, a fellow yWhale YPO member. And so, Mike, you've spent a little bit of time kind of looking into silks, not because you're a horse guy, but because you clearly are interested in kind of the next generation of Web3, and metaverse is absolutely included. So I thank you for coming on here today. Dan, let's go jump back over to you and a little background. So where did you come from? What did you want to be when you grew up? And how did you end up on here?
Sure. So I'm originally from Los Angeles. I moved to New York City when I was 23 years old to go to law school. I went to NYU and did not think I was going to practice law. I wanted to be an entrepreneur, but I did very well in school, got a great job at a big firm, and practiced corporate bankruptcy law for a couple of years at a firm called Weil Gotshal. Learned a lot about businesses and how they fail. That's kind of the nice thing about corporate bankruptcy is you get to see kind of where the needle, jumped off the record player. So that was a really cool experience, but I quickly realized I wanted to be an entrepreneur, and that's what I did. At the end of 1994, I quit practicing law, and I started my first venture-backed company, a company called Part Miner. And it was right around the beginning of the internet. The internet was really kind of commercialized in 1995 in a clunky way, but it was available to the public. Around the same time eBay started, around the same time Amazon started, I started a company called Part Miner. It became the preeminent B2B exchange for the semiconductor industry. So every vertical had a winner, and we were the winner in the semiconductor industry. Very large companies invested in us. We built a massive platform, had about 1,000 employees in 28 countries, and rode the wave of the internet. I ran that business for about 11 years. I sold out to a private equity secondary market firm. The company ultimately sold to a public company well after the bubble burst. And I started my second company shortly thereafter, a company called Portero, which is essentially should have been the Real if you're familiar with that company. It's a luxury goods business. We were the exchange for the luxury goods industry, backed by Richemont, which is the second largest conglomerate of luxury goods in the world. I ran that company with a partner for 2 years, and ultimately stepped out. I wrote a book after that, a book on consumerism and the internet, which became a bestseller in 2007. Ran around doing a lot of public speaking, and was encouraged to write another book. And I decided, nope, I want to go back to being an entrepreneur. So I started my third company. This was my only non-technology business, called Make Meaning, which was a really cool experiential retail concept in arts and crafts. Big box, heavily branded stores where you could literally decorate a cake, make glassware, ceramics, candles, soap, jewelry, stationery, lots of really cool things. And we rolled out about 20 stores all over the world. That was fun. And then I went back to tech. I took off a year to 2 years between each business, and in 2017 started a company called the Crown League. And our promise was to institutionalize fantasy football into a professional sport. And the way we were doing that was by creating public entities where the equity was represented in the form of security tokens, and the players were represented in the form of NFTs. Now, this was very early in Web3.
Yeah.
And not from a technology perspective as much as from adoption by consumers and regulatory. And so we went down a path, raised a lot of money, built a very complex and promising business to essentially take fantasy football, marry it to the blockchain, and create a media company that covered the game in the context of our league. So imagine watching For those of you that that play fantasy football, imagine watching the red zone, which aggregates all of the touchdowns and important plays during the course of the day. And instead of them talking about Tom Brady throwing a touchdown for the Buccaneers, they're talking about Tom Brady throwing a touchdown for the Philadelphia Sidekicks, and all the plays being broadcast and contextualized as if they're talking about your team. Um, and that was a very cool business. A little early, we ultimately sold it to the NFL spun out their Hall of Fame assets to a SPAC called the Hall of Fame Villages, and they acquired the business and ultimately launched the first season, I think, a year ago. And
So you've been around the block to
I have, I
say the
have.
least. So before we jump into the current project, which is why you're here, can we jump back to 1994, 95?
Sure.
And I'd love to kind of hear your thoughts about, right at that cusp of Web 1 getting mainstream adoption. And I think that today people really struggle. And in fact, for a lot of our younger, YNGers and whatnot, they have no idea what it was like pre-internet to live in that world. Talk to us about that you knew something was coming, but the rest of the world still thought it was just some like little fad that nerds were going to play with.
It's so interesting because it does take me back to a different era, right? I thought in 1995 that the world was going to change. And by 1996, money was falling from the sky. In fact, if you had a business and bought a URL, you could call yourself an internet company and raise $5 million overnight, because people had no idea what an internet company was, what a .com was. And so I watched the transition from nobody knowing what the internet was to a very clunky internet, if you remember the World Wide Web and Netscape and all of those platforms that Outlook Explorer. And they were very clunky in the beginning. There was very little content. And it rapidly evolved. I would say there was a tipping point probably around late 1996. Emails came about and became adopted very quickly. I remember dating a girl where we were sending each other faxes, because email didn't exist. She was in Italy and I was in the U.S.
Yeah, and I think the one I want to really, when we talk about email, and let's pretend like a number of our audience doesn't even understand what a crazy concept, because it wasn't email back then; it was electronic mail.
It's Eudora. I used Eudora.
Yeah,
Eudora.
But if you were on like Prodigy and you wanted to and you had a friend that was on CompuServe, you couldn't talk to each other. Like
they were closed bulletin boards.
Yeah. So it's very much like what, we see with Ethereum and Solana. Like we see bridges now because people know that you want to be cross chain, but it's clunky. It's a mess. It's a disaster. And that used to be it. You had to like send an email to a specific address, like an entirely different thing. It was chaos.
Yeah. I mean, you'll appreciate this. In 1995, looking back at Internet 1.0, I would argue that in our lifetime, the internet was, up to today, the most significant invention that impacted our world, right? It opened up communication, it opened up commerce, it opened up frictionless exchange of information, lots of things that changed our world. And so my test for people that, say they understand blockchain, is very simple. When I say to you that blockchain is going to impact our world 10 times more than the internet did, does that resonate with you? Do you understand the significance of what's about to happen in our world? And most people, include my very highly sophisticated network, can't answer that question. They have no clue. And I would argue that in 1995, most consumers had no clue. And when they looked at people investing in the internet, they were laughing at them. They were like, "You guys are crazy.
Yeah,
this is all going to go to zero."
No, there's the famous interviews.
Right? A lot did go to zero, and
yeah, of course a lot did, because there's always chaos before there's order, right? The greatest evolutions in our world always start with revolutions, right? The Wild West formed into our democracy. You always see chaos before order. And so we're in that phase right now, right? People are just trying to figure it out. And what's unique here is that there's still so much friction, and it's still not mainstream, but we're getting there. I think that, and this is really a good segue, NFTs are something that consumers can relate to, right? They're visual. And gaming is something consumers can relate to, and so we're beginning to see the very early stages of mainstream adoption, and we have a ways to go. but it's going to come pretty fast and furious.
Yeah.
I think from where we are right now.
Oh yeah, I mean, what it's hard to believe. Everyone thinks, oh my God, the blockchain is so advanced, things are happening. But, back in 95 and, even 96 and going a little further, the best uses for that technology didn't come for another, quite a few years. Hadn't been conceptualized. And I think that we're there right now. I mean, we look at everything that's happening and people are saying, hey, this blockchain is clearly the winner. This technology or this coin is clearly the winner. And I'd like to point out we're still in the first inning here. Like we've barely even scratched the surface.
We're barely scratching the
Yeah,
surface.
I mean
right now.
it is so early. But let's segue because again, as someone who's lived this life, you've been through Web 1, you've been through Web 2, and gotta love you. You're back for round 3 here with Web 3. Talk to us a little bit about like what brought you into the fold. What about cryptocurrencies, blockchain, and web made you want to come do this again? And then let's talk a little bit about what you're building and why.
Sure. So I never thought I would see a repeat of what I experienced during the heyday of the internet, and then blockchain came about, and I lived it. I was there during what we'll call the early days of Web 3, and then I was like, I'm blessed. I can't believe that I'm experiencing this again, and now it's 10 times bigger. It's like this is my third bite at the apple. I describe the environment I'm living in right now as I'm standing under a waterfall with my mouth open, and I can't consume a fraction of what's out there. So super exciting. I'm attracted to bleeding edge technology, which is why I get involved very early. I think when you look at my successes, and I swing for the fences. I'm a startup tech entrepreneur. So the outcomes when you invest in my companies are binary. I'm either going to hit it out of the park or I'm going to strike out. And not that dissimilar to the baseball analogy, right? Strikeout, I mean, home run hitters have the biggest strikeout records too, because there's a correlation between taking risk and failure and success and the order of magnitude of your success. So I'm attracted to these type of things, and I'm a techie, so I keep my finger on the pulse of what's going on, and I just jumped right into this. I mean, you know, I never stepped off the gas with crypto. I was an early adopter. I bought my first Bitcoin transaction was $220 for a Bitcoin,
Okay.
and then I started trading. And then when Bitcoin got away from me, I said, you know what? I'm not going to trade anymore. I'm just buying and accumulating. So I have a standing purchase for a handful of tokens that I've been buying every day for the last 2 years. And I have a very strong conviction around certain tokens and why I believe that they have significant potential value and sustainable value. Outside the scope of this conversation, but happy to talk about it at some point.
No, I think it's a very interesting point and something for those people that may have jumped in a little early into some things. I talk often about my first Bitcoin purchase was, very early 2010, 100 Bitcoins for $20. And so the problem that I had for years was I had no value in these things because when I threw away that computer, like it was the last thing on my mind. It wasn't, I went to the trouble of acquiring them, but there was no wallets back then. It was even before the big hacks and some of those issues. But everything in the news you heard about Bitcoin was always negative. And I go, I did that. We'll see where it goes. And I think the thing to remember is for anyone that did get disenfranchised early in the technology, it's okay to come back and say like, oops, like now let's figure out a way to reentry because we're still so early. Someone who said, I'm not going to use the internet, in 1995 because they had a bad experience in 1993. Like, okay, it's 1997 now. Would you like to try again? And so I think that that's a really important story, Dan, that you said that it's like, it's okay to be wrong. It's okay to say like, okay, I have to change my strategy or change my thought process because the world is clearly going in this direction.
Yeah, and I would say, Jay, that it's not about when you got in to Bitcoin. It's whether you had the stomach to hold it, how long you held it for. Because I can tell you, I sold that $220, token. I forgot about it actually. You know what I did is I bought it, and I played around with it just to play around with the technology.
Yeah.
And there wasn't much you could do with it back then, but
Yeah.
if you got creative, you could kind of navigate different places that would accept it. And I did, and I bought things, and then I forgot about it.
Yeah.
And a few years
There's
later,
only so
somebody's
much
like,
heroin. Only so much.
exactly.
It gets boring.
And then one day I open up the paper and they talk about Bitcoin being at $3,000 or something, and I'm like, wait a second, let me see if I still can find that Bitcoin that I bought. And sure enough, and then I flipped it. And then I started looking at the technology more seriously, and then I started buying it and then trading it, and the rest is history. But I agree. I think we're at the very early stages. People don't remember that Amazon was once a bookstore, an online bookstore, right?
Yeah.
And it's the largest, one of the largest companies, one of the most valuable companies in the world, it's literally changed our world and our lives.
Yeah.
And I think that we're in for some of the greatest companies in the world coming out of this space.
Yeah. And it's the same thing. If you bought, Amazon's IPO way back when, and you said, I've already invested in with them, I'm done. You really missed out on the evolution of the technology and the platform and everything they've done. So,
but for every dollar you invested, you made about $20,000.
Or you could have bought a book
if you held on to it. Or
yeah,
you could have bought a book.
And that's my problem. Is even the 100 Bitcoins I bought for the $20, had they gotten to $10 a piece, I would have sold them.
Exactly.
So it was never, I have no qualms about it, and it's a funny story, is it? But no, I love it. So let's pivot over, and I really want to hear about Silks. I mean, clearly, again, tons of experience, Web 1, Web 2, lots of things going on. Let's go through Silks, because again, with this being a full metaverse play, there's a lot more going on than a traditional NFT project. You've got a lot of tech, and clearly you have a background to manage this. So, if we can run through your deck, I'd really appreciate kind of a good understanding from where you're at today, as well as where you're going.
Sure. So, I've been in the online gaming business, so to speak. My last blockchain company, was in fantasy football. Gaming is one of the first on-ramps to major technology shifts, and the first point where consumers tend to adopt. And we saw that in a few different places, right? We saw that with poker. Poker was once a game that was frowned upon. It was played in the back rooms of restaurants and in your basement with your friends, but never really a glamified game. Online poker came about in 2001 and literally changed the nature of the game, using the internet to create an interface between millions of people that could now enjoy this game in a competitive way. And so that literally revolutionized the game. Today, there are 60 million people in the United States that play online poker. 2009, the same thing happened for fantasy sports. Fantasy sports was a game where you got together with your friends in your house, you settled contests with newspapers, and the internet came around. Somebody came up with the idea of automating it and integrating it into a game that could be played amongst strangers. And lo and behold, fantasy sports literally came out and reinvented how we consume sports overnight. Again, 60 million people in the United States play that game on a regular basis. We think blockchain is going to revolutionize gaming, and we want to be a part of it. So I created the first platform, which I talked to you about earlier, and now we're creating Silks. Silks is literally going to port the real world of thoroughbred racing into the metaverse, and that's what we'll talk about. So why don't we, what I'd love to do is give you a little foundation for what I'm seeing, what we see, and essentially the background for why we're moving in this direction.
Please.
So if we go to the next slide. The first thing is Web3, and I know I'm talking to an educated audience here. The internet was created 25 years ago as we see it today, certainly from a consumer perspective. And what we see is the internet being literally torn down and rebuilt into Web3, the third generation of the internet. And if you look at the historical internet, it was really replicating our lives in a two-dimensional way. So if you bought a television 30 years ago, you would order a catalog in the mail. It would show up. You'd flip through the catalog, call up a television company, maybe visit the store and buy it after you've done your research. Today, you don't do something that dissimilar. You go on Best Buy, you scroll down a two-dimensional database that shows you the most current televisions that are available, and you might just order a TV that way, or you might go to the store with the information you acquired. Not very different. Web 3.0 promises to recreate the way we behave in the real world online, and essentially create a relationship with people and with consumables and durable goods in a way that has never been experienced before. So, you know, in a year from now, you'll be able to walk down a grocery store. It'll feel like a video game. You'll be able to grab things off the shelf, look at them, throw them in your cart, and check out like you would in a grocery store. And in 2 or 3 years from now, you'll do it with a headset, and it will feel as real as we feel sitting talking to each other right now, 1,000 miles away. So that's Web3, and we want to be a part of it. We want to create something that really is relevant and changes the world.
Awesome.
The next thing we see on the next slide is the enabling technologies for Web3. I won't get into a lot of detail around blockchain. But it's blockchain, it's the crypto tokens that are powering blockchain, and it's NFTs that are creating a whole new way to create, to interact with assets, to create assets, and the early adoption is taking place in art, collectibles, and gaming, which is not unusual because blockchain and crypto is hard to get your head around, right? The average consumer, really, it takes me about an hour to literally build the building blocks for somebody that's unfamiliar with it to truly understand it and understand its implications.
Yep.
With NFTs, it's much more digestible because you can relate to it as something that you visually see and that exists in the real world.
Absolutely. No, and it's such a, once people understand it, it's a much easier concept to understand than traditional art, because there's you can trace it, you can see it, you can find data.
I'll share with you and with the audience something that's really an easy way for me to get people to cross the bridge. So people ask me, they're like, I don't understand it. It's a digital piece of art. Can't I just copy it? And my response to them is, you can copy it, just like anybody can copy real art. And I take them to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York and I say, look at that Renoir. It's a $300 million painting. It's actually priceless, but you could probably buy it for $300 million. And when you stand there, you're in awe looking at this thing. Why? And the real answer is because I'm in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I know it's real. I know it's a one of a kind because it's sitting here. It's the context that the destination gives you that makes it special. And so I take them to there's a company called oncyber.io, Cyber Factory 2. I don't know if you're familiar with it. No. They build structures. They're microverses where you can own a structure in the form of an NFT, and you can decorate that structure with your own NFTs. And I encourage you to take a look at it. And so I'll take people into one of these microstructures and I'll say, look around. This is a collection of NFTs. And what you're looking at is a collection of Bored Apes. And I could tell from the collection there's probably $2 million worth of art sitting in this structure that we can walk around and look at. And I can tell you this is worth millions of dollars because all I have to do is walk up to the art, push a button, and it'll take me to the wallet. It'll take me to OpenSea where I can validate that this is genuine. And I'm looking at something that I can sell for $250,000, $300,000 or more. And that's essentially the same thing. So they begin to understand that where we're moving as a society is you no longer need something tangible to appreciate its value. That's just the future.
Absolutely.
This slide really talks about how early we are. So less than 2 years ago, there were, in 2020, $9 million in NFT sales. Last year, $25 billion. And this year we're at a run rate of over $100 billion in sales. It's crazy.
Yep.
And then you look at the MetaMask adoption, right? In July of 2020, there were in the entire world, MetaMask is the largest non-custodial wallet. You need it to buy NFTs, right?
Yep.
550,000 people had NFT had MetaMask wallets in 2020. By the middle of last year, that number grew to 10 million, and as of December, it was 21 million. We'll see this at hundreds of millions or at a billion by the end of this year.
Crazy.
That's how fast we're moving.
And no one actually likes MetaMask.
Oh, it's horrible. And I think that's the biggest friction right now to consumer adoption. For me to teach a neophyte how to buy an NFT, right? The first thing they have to do is buy cryptocurrencies. So they have to go to Coinbase, set up an account, right? Then they have to fund the account. Then they have to buy Ethereum. Then they have to transfer. Then they have to create a MetaMask wallet, transfer Ethereum to a MetaMask wallet, and then they have to figure out how to connect it to OpenSea and how to actually transact. It's not easy.
No, we do it every day.
And that
totally understand.
Right? And so we need to fix that first, and it's coming. I believe that we'll be there by the end of the year, and I think that will create the on-ramp for the masses to come on board. So we're close.
Absolutely.
But that's the friction. And this is the really important slide that will transition us into silks. So if you look at historically at gaming, gaming was, essentially there was a video game company. They'd create a title and build a franchise around it, build a community of users, sell you access to it, but you never really owned anything. So even one of the ubiquitous titles like Fortnite, you could buy skins to create custom characters. You couldn't take those characters and move them to another platform. In fact, you didn't even own the skin that you paid for. The only way to transfer those assets was to sell your account, which some sites would allow you to do and some sites wouldn't allow you to do.
Yep.
That's the history of video gaming. And what we're seeing now is the convergence of video gaming, gambling, and investing into a new category called play to earn. Some people call it GameFi. And what that is essentially a new model where it's essentially crowdsourcing communities that want to get behind a project that they can own a piece of, have a seat at the table in the direction of that project, and make money playing that game. That's where the future is. The future of this new entertainment. It's really a new entertainment category, and it's going to revolutionize the way we interact socially, how we entertain ourselves, and how we spend our time in the form of gaming and entertainment. And that's the space that we're in, and that's the audience that we're looking to meet there.
Yep, absolutely.
The metaverse is a catalyst for these games. You're seeing every major company in the world converging on this space. And you asked me an earlier question around 1995 and today.
Yep.
It's the same thing. I remember the biggest companies in the world trying to figure out, what are we going to do about this internet? First, they were scared, right?
Oh, yeah.
They were scared of being disintermediated. And then they eventually were forced to develop strategies. The same thing is happening right now. Every major company in the world right now is thinking about how they respond to this. What are they going to do? How are they going to carve out their piece of this future? Because they have to. If you're static, you die.
Yep.
Nike acquired Artifact, one of the greatest NFT companies to date. We don't even know how much they paid for that company, but I was there when they dropped the CloneX vials, and I bought one. It was $9,250.
Oh my gosh!
And I sold mine I had a very generic one that I sold for $54,000 a few months ago, and that was silly. I should have kept it because I missed out on about $12,000 worth of free airdrops.
It's so and this is the thing for people to understand. For every one the NFT thing that's promised with some hype that actually does this, I have to buy 100 that go nowhere. And so, when you say, "Oh, I got out too early," it's like what? There's times where I've 10x'd on an NFT, and I tell people I'm selling. They're like, "No, you should wait." I'm like, "Wait for what? What? Where is it going to go?"
Well, I mean, if you bought an Andy Warhol, in 1970, it's still growing in value. So in terms of art and
I don't, I'm not an art guy, so I struggle,
but I hear you.
I struggle with some of these things too. But no, it's amazing to watch. It's amazing to watch some of these valuations. And when people talk about where are we, it's are we in a bubble? It's like, oh yeah. I mean, we absolutely,
of course, we
are in a bubble. But that there's always winners that will come out of this, and that's where the maturity and the teams really come into play. A good team, a good founder is always who I invest in. I mean, that's my 20 years in VC. It's like you invest in the team and a little less in the project.
I completely agree. And forgive the analogy. They always say you bet on the jockey, not the horse, right?
I don't know. I've never done horse racing.
Although the reality is in horse
Not in
racing,
silks. Right.
not in silks. And in the reality of horse racing, jockeys are actually more of a commodity than people think.
More fungible.
And more fungible, yes. Microsoft is acquiring Activision for $69 billion. Facebook rebranded to Meta and is recreating itself in a more three-dimensional, experiential way. So this is just a little smattering of what's going on. I'm talking to companies every day that are trying to figure this out. Again, what we're building a play-to-earn gamified metaverse around thoroughbred horse racing. And we're literally porting over a real world economy and replicating it in the same way. And I'm excited kind of to share the vision. So let's go to this slide over here, because this is really where the economy starts. This is the real world thoroughbred horse racing economy. Okay. And it starts with horses.
So,
right?
So these are actual stats from existing, like, in real life horses.
Yes, this is the real economy of U.S. thoroughbred horse racing. Okay. It starts with 20,000 horses that are born every year and registered to race. So when you have a horse that's born and you want it to race as an adult, it needs to be registered with the national registrar, which is called the Jockey Club. You have to send in DNA samples and records to prove that your horse came from the original thoroughbred, comes from that bloodline. Once you register your horse, it's now qualified to race. During the course of its early growth, horses are sold to investors. They're sold as weanlings when they're born. They're sold as yearlings when they're 1 year old, and then they're sold as 2-year-olds and onwards. In this country, you have to be 2 years old as a horse to be able to race. And so the most popular auctions are the yearling sales, because the horse is already developed but not yet racing. And those sales attract a significant amount of transactions. The aggregate number of volume of horses sold in terms of dollars is about $1 billion a year.
Wow.
Which is a big number. Once you buy a horse, you have to house it, feed it, care for it, and train it to get it ready to race, because it can't race till it's 2. That costs about $40,000 or $50,000 a year. And you can outsource that to a farm. When your horse is ready to race, and typically it's between 2 and 3 years old, they can enter one of 30,000 races that are hosted in this country. Those 30,000 races attract over 50 million people who bet over $11 billion on the races. And the tracks, in order to incentivize the owners of these horses to race, give away 10% of that prize pool, of that money, of the handle, to the owners of the winning horses. And that's about $1 billion a year. So as a horse owner, you're vying for your share of the $1 billion in prize purse and of the $1 billion in breeding opportunities, right? A horse in the real world is valued based on its prospects of winning races and based on its desirability as a breeding candidate. By example, I'll give you kind of an example of a real world horse and its value. A horse that you might have bought for $100,000 is 1 year old, that races and at 3 years old enters the Kentucky Derby. The Kentucky Derby is a race for the 20 best 3-year-old horses in the United States. You can actually enter one from outside the U.S., but it's 20 of the best horses that are 3 years old. If your horse enters that race and wins that race, it will win millions of dollars. But you will also be able to retire that horse shortly after that race and get at least $100,000 a pop for its breeding rights. A male horse or a stallion can breed at least 200 horses a year, if not more. And they're beginning to cap that, but they could technically breed 400 horses a year, but we'll call it 200. At $100,000 a pop.
It's a busy horse.
It's a busy horse, yeah. And that horse is making $20 million a year for you. That horse has a life expectancy of 25 to 30 years old and can breed for most of its life. So if you own that horse, you now have a revenue stream of $20 million a year. You could probably sell that horse for a couple of million dollars. And you paid 2 years ago $100,000 for that horse. That's something that you can't do in any other industry. And it's the reason why people are addicted to this game, because you can create so much value so quickly. And that's just one example. There are 50 graded races in this country that would create that kind of outcome if you have a horse that consistently is winning. And if we have time, I'll show you some of the statistics, which are mind-boggling.
Awesome. No, this is fabulous.
So that's the economy. The way we're recreating that economy is by creating derivative assets and tokenizing them. So what is a derivative asset? The Dow Jones Industrial Average is an index that tracks a basket of 40 stocks, right? 30 or 40 stocks. The S&P 500 is an index that tracks 500 stocks. The index moves up or down based on the value of the underlying stocks, so based on their productivity. If the stocks in the aggregate go up in value, the S&P goes up in value and vice versa. You can buy instruments that essentially allow you to profit from those movements. And those are called options, ETFs, and futures. In sports, fantasy sports operate the same way. You essentially acquire derivative assets of real players whose productivity determines if you're going to win real money. So when you draft a quarterback or a wide receiver to your team, their productivity determines how many points you get in a given game and how much money you're going to win in that game or in that season. We're doing the same thing in this space. What we're doing is we are tokenizing, we are creating a derivative digital asset of every horse born in this country and registered to race each year, and tokenizing them into a digital asset in the form of an NFT. And if we go to the next slide, I'll explain to you what that token does.
Okay.
So that token tracks every real world horse from the day that they're born. It records their bloodline. It records every time the owner of that horse publishes a workout or a training schedule. That's very popular. It's kind of like the combine in football, where you get to watch a horse's productivity before it ever races. It also tracks sibling productivity. So a horse that hasn't raced yet is valued based on a few things. It's valued based on its bloodline. So does it come from championship horses that have demonstrated productivity? Its value fluctuates based on its workout. How well is it training? How fast is it running on the track? And even more importantly than that, it's valued based on its sibling productivity. So a typical horse will have hundreds of older siblings, many of them just beginning to race. And when those horses race and win big races, the value of your horse goes up significantly. So you might buy a horse at auction for $50,000. Its older sibling wins a big graded race, and that horse could be worth $500,000 overnight. And we see that every single day. It tracks the sales history. It tracks news about the horse. Every time your horse is scheduled to race, it notifies you. Every time your horse races, it notifies you. It tracks their breeding, their offspring, the productivity of their offspring. There's lots of data here. Sports is made up of two things: data and content, right? Visual content and data. And we bring together all of that. And if you own one of these tokens, you now have access to all of that information in real time being pushed to you. The idea for us is to create the equivalent, both economically and emotionally, that you experience as the owner of a real horse in the digital world. And that's the promise of what will happen when you buy one of these NFTs.
So every horse, of which, if we go back over to this slide here, so we're saying there's 20,000 new horses that are registered annually.
Correct.
You're saying that there's going to be 20,000, or not probably 100% of these, but you're saying that there's going to be all these new horses that are coming into play, and there's one NFT that is a one-to-one representation of that horse. And everything about it.
Correct. So the best way to look at it is in a traditional sport like football, baseball, basketball, hockey. Every year you have a class of rookies that come in, right?
Yep.
New entrants that are competitors that are added to the teams.
Okay.
In the case of traditional sports, there are a few hundred rookies a year that come into the sport, and they have a a life cycle. So a running back in the NFL has an average career of 3 years. A wide receiver might have an average career of 6 years, and so on and so forth. In the horse racing world, we have 20,000 rookies that enter the market each year. Those rookies can race between the ages of 2 and 10 years old. And they can breed for most of their lives, and they can live for up to 30 years. So what you're buying is a competitor in a sport that can be productive for a very long period of time and can produce benefits for you as the owner based on that productivity. So these are long-term assets
So
that you're investing in.
so in like fantasy football, like Mike could choose his team, I could choose my team, and we could both have some of the same players on those teams. But
Correct.
you're in this case, only one person can have the NFT of that one horse.
Correct. Except that in our model, you can syndicate your horse like you can in the real world
Okay.
by selling an interest in that horse to other people. So you can fractionalize your horse and invite your friends or your family
So
to.
we need to start differentiating between real world and NFTs. So you can fractionalize ownership of your
That's correct.
NFT'd horse. Okay.
Correct. And the way we do that is there are 10 tokens that make up a horse. There's a governance token and 9 limited partnership tokens. And so if you own the governance token, you control the decisions that you make around that horse. But you could also be a passive partner in that horse by owning an LP token. And that's kind of how technically we're doing it. And these are all kind of freely tradable. So by comparison to fantasy football, most fantasy football teams are made up of people who partner together to buy in together. So you can sell an interest in your team to a friend who becomes your partner in that team for the season, or for, if you're in a dynasty league, forever. So it actually mimics both the real world of horse racing, where syndication is a very common thing to do, and the real world of fantasy sports, which is a very common thing to do as well.
Okay. So let's ask the question right here. So we've got a one-to-one representation of a physical real world asset. Who is the actual like owner of that horse? Do they get anything from this, or are they one of the LPs, or is there it just exists 100% in the digital world and there's no tie back to the original horse?
So that's a great question. And the answer is that the owners of the actual horse have nothing to do with this platform, at least on the outset. These are digital assets that are derived from historical, statistical, sports data that's integral to the actual sport. And the Supreme Court has determined many years ago that that's public domain, regardless of infringement on publicity rights and regardless of infringement on trademark.
Okay.
And the reason they determined that, and the case law that was developed around that, came out of fantasy sports. It's the reason fantasy sports exists today. You can use the name Tom Brady. You can use the fact that he threw 3 touchdowns for the Buccaneers 10 weeks ago in a game. What you can't do without licensing is use his likeness, so use a picture of him and attach it to that data. And you also can't use the logo of the Buccaneers and attach it to that data. But the data itself and his name combined, you're allowed to use royalty-free and without permission.
Okay.
And the same, and we rely on that body of law, because this is essentially our platform, as you'll understand as we go through the game and the economics, is essentially mirroring a dynasty fantasy horse ownership game that tracks the real world at its core.
Awesome.
And so that's the answer. Now, we believe that the real world of horses, that owners in the real world will want to own their horse equivalent. So we think there will be a market for owners of their horses to buy their digital horses. We also think that our horses will become ways for horse owners to arbitrage their races. So, for example, if your horse was in a $1 million race against 12 other horses, you might want to own some of the competitive horses, because if your horse loses, you're still going to win money in the metaverse if you own one of the other horses. So it could be used as a arbitrage tool. And we actually think there's going to be a lot of very interesting dynamics between the experts in the real world of horse racing and the neophytes that come out of crypto that are just learning about their assets. And we're going to see a lot of market um, volatility driven by both sides. And that's a conversation I could have for a long time to tell you about, because it's
Okay.
just fascinating.
So I'm gonna. This is where I ask the really fun question. As the only non-lawyer on this call, you're selling an asset in the digital world that is tied to a physical real world asset as well, with the expectations that there is a possibility of return. How is this classified?
So it's a great question. And we take the position that we are a fantasy game, and that our assets are no different than if you acquired Tom Brady as a quarterback for your fantasy league. Um, we deal in tokens. The tokens have no direct value from us. And when we talk about tokenomics, you'll see that. This is a game. And the assets that we sell, while they derive their productivity and gameplay from the real world, they have no legal relationship or ownership of any real world assets, which means that when you're buying a tokenized horse, that horse, you have no rights to the real horse. So we're not selling you a derivative asset of a real horse. We're selling you a derivative asset that has legal rights to a real world horse. Those are arguably considered securities, right? So if somebody fractionalizes a real racehorse and sells you an interest in that horse, that's a security. And there are companies that are actually doing that. You can do that as in a limited partnership structure, or you can do it in a public market structure, which makes it a security. This is a game.
Okay.
It's a fantasy game, and that's what we rely on to operate this business. And there's a whole set of governing laws, both federal and state laws, that drive that body of law.
Perfect. Awesome.
It's outstanding.
All right.
Now, having said that, I will tell you that the waters are still very murky. This is very early.
Yeah.
And I'm not giving advice here or legal opinions here. That's something that everybody has to do, and we'll see how this space develops.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've got some different ways to get involved here.
Correct. So the first thing you can do is buy a horse. You can buy a horse. You can own the horse. During the period between when a horse is born and when they actually start racing, there's an activity called pinhooking that takes place. And there's a whole profession around this where people buy and sell horses based on data, such as bloodline, productivity of siblings, training productivity, and other things. So you might see a horse win a graded race this Sunday and start looking into the background of that horse and the bloodline and say, wow, who else is related to that horse out there? And you might find a horse that's directly related to that horse and say, you know what, I'm going to take a bet on this horse because that horse looks really good. I'll bet you this horse might do just as well. And so you can buy and sell horses based on these factors. And we expect that there's going to be a lot of that activity, especially before horses are racing. You can fractionalize and syndicate your horse. So you can invite friends to own the horse collectively with you, or sell pieces of your horse to the public. So let's say you bought, remember these horses are, I didn't say this, but these horses are going to be dropped annually in a blind traditional NFT drop to create a very level playing field. So in the real world, what happens is you go to an auction. And in that auction, you're competing with very sophisticated people that are bidding up horses. And so you may spend $100,000 on a horse. You might spend $2 million on a horse. And obviously, just like in the real world of sports, money is king. And so people can get advantages by having more money. In our game, we start with a gamified distribution of our NFTs in a random way. So what's really unique about our business that's very different from traditional NFT projects is that our NFTs are organically scarce, which means we don't create rarity tables around a horse. Our horses are rare because a mare can only produce about 13 horses in her lifetime, and a stallion can produce, call it 4,000 horses in their lifetime. So the combination between a stallion and a mare creates rarity. The fact that your horse sold at auction as a yearling for $500,000 creates rarity because there might have been only 3,000 horses in the entire crop that sold for that amount of money. So these are all organic rarity and not contrived rarity like a lot of these projects that say, okay, we're going to give 5,000 of this collection green eyes and 3,000 of this collection button down shirts and 2,000 pieces this type of eyewear. We do that in our avatars, which I'll talk about later, but we don't. But with our horses, it's organic. So there's a lot of that. You can buy a horse in an NFT drop for, let's call it an ETH, and all of a sudden you ended up getting a very valuable horse. You can essentially sell off 2/10 of it for what you paid for it, and now you own the rest of the horse free and clear. Or you could sell half of it off, take your money off the table, make a little bit of money, and free ride on the balance. Those are all options.
Perfect. Well, I'm going to push right over into this slide here, which is tokenomics,
Yep.
and really because this is where I want to start diving in and understanding, because there's a lot going on that we're hearing, but I think this slide's very interesting because I mean, if there's anything Web3 that's kind of a buzzword, it's right here. So walk us through kind of the tokenomics. I take it you're on the Ethereum ecosystem.
So we're on the Ethereum ecosystem for the first drop of our avatars.
Okay.
And we will be announcing a partnership with a large level 2, an Ethereum level 2 platform
Okay.
that will be driving the balance of the economy.
Okay.
So it's all tied to the Ethereum blockchain, but we want to create efficiencies from a transaction cost, and so we'll be using a level 2 protocol for most of our assets. This is structured as a DAO. So Game of Silks, which you see at the top right in a pink icon, is our company. We own 100% of the DAO day one, and we will be the service provider for the DAO as long as we have control of the DAO, and then eventually the community can determine who they're going to use to operate the business. The DAO produces all of our assets. So what you see is in the first transaction, the DAO is tokenizing the horses, selling them to the public. 100% of the proceeds from the sale of all of our assets go into the DAO. The DAO serves as a treasury, which is essentially the economic foundation of our ecosystem. It's also a major barrier to entry for people to replicate what we're doing. And when we go into the actual numbers, you'll see why. Every time a secondary market transaction takes place with one of our assets, a percentage of that transaction, 100% of a percentage of that transaction, goes into the DAO as a royalty. The DAO grows indefinitely and in perpetuity. And the only time money comes out of the DAO is to pay for services that need to be paid to support the infrastructure. Okay?
Okay.
Now,
I'm following along.
So with the sale of all of our assets and with all the transactions, the DAO continues to grow into a very healthy economic foundation. When your horses start racing and win races, you receive a transactional token called STT as a reward for your horse winning a race. And we use algorithms to calculate the appropriate amount to distribute to you to create parity with the real world and with our economy, so that if your horse wins $100,000 in the real world, you will eventually win $100,000 in the metaverse, the equivalent of $100,000 in the metaverse. That token can be used for two things. It can be used to transact on the platform, so you can buy horses, land, stables, other assets, wager on the platform with third parties. You can do a lot of things with that token on the platform in the metaverse. You can also exchange that token for SLK, which is the governance token for the DAO. If the DAO has $1 million in it, and there are 1 million SLK tokens, then each token is theoretically worth $1, or the liquidation value of the DAO, because the community can decide at any point to break the piggy bank and distribute the proceeds to the governance token holders, theoretically. So the only way to acquire SLK, and I should mention that both STT and SLK are non-inflationary tokens. They have fixed amounts and they will never exceed those amounts.
Okay.
That's a very unique model that's never existed before, to my knowledge, and has always been a flaw to many of these gamified economies. And so with STT, if we run out of tokens to reward racing and breeding, there is a mechanism to replenish that, and that's going to be driven by the secondary market, because the DAO will have to go out and buy those tokens to be able to redistribute them, which will create a market for that.
Yeah.
When your horse, so that's how you can acquire STT
Okay.
through racing. When your horse produces offspring, eventually that offspring will make its way back to the silks economy, right? So when a horse is born and it's 1 year old, if it's going to race, it will be tokenized into an NFT and sold on our platform. When that happens, whether you're the owner of the mare or the stallion, whoever owns that at the time of the sale will receive a distribution of STT automatically as a breeding fee, which will represent a percentage of the transaction of the sale. So by example, if you happen to be lucky enough to own a stallion that's producing 200 offspring a year, and you bought that stallion in the Genesis drop, so it was a 1 year old this year, in 3 years from now, after it's raced and won a few big races, it may be retired to breed. And in year 4, it will have produced 200 offspring, which in year 5 will become 1 year olds. And in year 5, when you look at our projections, you theoretically could receive the equivalent of thousands of dollars per offspring in a distribution for a breeding fee every year for the life of that horse. And so it will replicate the value of that real horse. It's pretty cool.
The entire ecosystem is amazing. Talk to me real quick about your team, because this is complex. And I mean, metaverses are generally simple. So you've got a game, a metaverse, NFTs. There's a lot going on. So define real quick the team behind this and how you're apps getting this done.
Sure. So I built a very tight team to start this project. I believe I sent you a list of our team, which you're welcome to share with the group if you'd like. But on the technology side, I have product and tech segregated. So I've got a product team. They control the look and feel of all the assets. They control all the development of the NFTs. So all the visualization features, all of the rigging, animation, functionality, interoperability, all of that takes place within our product group. And we have a team of about 12 people that are full-time on the team, either as contractors or as employees. On the technology side, we will be outsourcing. I have a head of technology who comes out of all of this, out of gaming, working for some of the largest companies with a lot of experience. And we're actually partnering we're in the final stages of signing the contract to partner with a YPOer that runs a leading boutique development shop in New York City. They're going to be managing the initial development of our smart contracts, which are going to power most of the in-game functionality. It's a team of 16 people that are going to be working pretty much full-time on this. And then we're going to be partnering with a Unity game shop, and that's all they do. This is going to be built on the Unity platform, there's two major platforms in Metaverse. There's Unreal and Unity.
Yep.
And everything you see out there is built on one of those two platforms. So we're using best of breed technology. Our white paper actually has quite a bit of detail on the tech, which I would refer your audience to.
Yep.
But this is a team of real experienced adults that have, at the leadership level, have done this many times. I will say we have a team of we also have a team of very young people that come out of this generation, that are in their early to mid 20s. Some of the best, brightest, and hardest working people that I've ever worked with, and they're passionate. They're very technology savvy. And it's just truly a pleasure to work with them.
That's amazing. Dan, you've got a team of people working on the product side, on the horses, on the avatars, on the
structures, on the metaverse, everything.
And then you got another team that's bifurcated and discrete that's working on the tech. But but you have the benefit of an interesting launch because when you launch, you still have another year, if I'm not mistaken, before you actually have to have the rubber hit the road.
Correct. So
And so, can you walk us through the timing?
absolutely. So you're spot on. The way we developed this project, and it was interesting because there was a lot of back and forth around engagement during a long period rollout. This is a large scale project. We've thought it through proof of concept. We have all the pieces in place. We know how to build this, and we have the roadmap. Um, but we have to stagger the development and we have the luxury of time. So rather than waiting till this is completely built, the first thing we're doing is we're dropping our Silks avatars. So a Silk avatar is your identity in the metaverse. In the real world of horse racing, um, the jockey wears a uniform that's called a silk. The silk is actually a family crest. It identifies the owner of the horse that the jockey is racing for. And it's typically draped around the horse, on their blinkers, on the jockey. You could find it in the stables, and it's the identity of the ownership. And there you can actually see what a Silks avatar looks like. Every Silks avatar has a unique identity, both the logo or the patterns that represent the uniform, as well as certain attributes around the way they look and they feel. And so that becomes your identity. You can walk around the metaverse. All of your assets become dressed with your identity. So, for example, in this particular case, you're looking at an avatar that has a horse wearing the same silks. And the reason for that is because we're a Web 3.0 enabled metaverse. So when you walk into the metaverse is reading your wallet, and every asset you own in the metaverse is now identified with you. Um, so that's the first drop. That's happening in 4 weeks. We are distributing a collection of 10,000 of these avatars. Their primary utility is one, it makes you a member of the community, an investor in the community. Two, it guarantees you a whitelist spot for the horse drop for our first crop of yearlings, which we expect to be sold out many times over. So you're guaranteed a horse, and then it's going to give you other utilities like airdrops and access to other assets as we develop this. So we kind of look at our Silks avatar holders as our early investors. That's the first piece. Once you've bought the avatar, you'll then have an opportunity to participate in our yearling drop. That's going to take place towards the end of the summer. And that's going to be the sale of. We're not actually going to sell 20,000 in the first year. We're culling the crop, and we're literally identifying the best prospects to release as our first generation, so that our users have the greatest opportunity to have a good experience. So in the real world, 20,000 horses are born and sold. Of those 20,000 horses, a small percentage of those horses will never race. They just never get through training to be good enough to race. A percentage of those horses will race but never win. And so there's a lot of risk in horse racing ownership, right? We provide a variety of ways to offset that risk, where you can you build a stable of multiple horses, you can syndicate horses, you can pool horses by staking them to a farm. There's a lot of ways to diversify your risk. But because these are yearlings, they have a year before they can race.
Right.
So we will literally have a year to build out the full functionality of the metaverse from the end of the summer, or about a year and a half from now.
So I think a lot of people are going to be able to figure out where this goes in that sense, but what they might not see is how you get there. What has to happen from the code side, from the team development side, to get from the whitelist auction, which let's say that happens in around May 1st ish, to the first races on the executive? Dan has to get a bunch of stuff accomplished. What has to happen for this to actually be a viable project? Because you probably can't slip your dates, right? You have to line up with the races in year two.
Absolutely.
You have some time, but tell us what has to happen.
Sure. So the two big functions that don't have to happen for a while are breeding and racing, right? Which is also the essence of the economy. So early on, we're going to have the ability for you to trade your horses right out of the gate. No pun intended. There's a lot of horse puns out there that are very relevant to pretty much any business.
It turns out that this industry's already infected us.
Exactly. The metaverse will be built out. You'll be able to buy land. You'll be able to build structures. That's going to come towards the end of this year. You'll be able to syndicate very quickly. You'll be able to pool your horse and stake them to a horse farm. So a lot of the community engagement will already be there. The big two things that have to happen are the smart contracts associated with breeding, the oracles that acquire our data, and the scholar program that allows the public to mine data and populate our database. And finally, the biggest component to this is the racing. You will be able to visit any racetrack in this country and eventually in the world in our metaverse and literally experience the racetrack as if you were there. You'll be able to watch your horse race in real time in your silks in the racetrack. You'll be able to go up to the betting window, place a bet at Churchill Downs or at Belmont or at Del Mar. That bet will route directly to their ADW, and they'll make. We're not getting into the gaming business, into the gambling business. We're facilitating these tracks to build their structures. They're feeding us their real-time data. We're simulcasting with our NFTs the races. So when the race is taking place at Keeneland in Kentucky, you can visit Keeneland in our metaverse and watch the horse race in real time from the stands. You'll be able to get together in a suite with your buddies that own the race with you. And if your horse wins, you'll be able to walk down to the winner's circle as if you were the real owner of that horse.
Will there be creepy, degenerate gamblers, sulking away from the betting windows as they lose their?
One of the big value propositions for the industry and why the industry is going to want to work with us, and without getting into a lot of detail, we're steeped in this industry, and there's a lot of exciting announcements that we hope to release in the coming months as we begin to bring this industry on board. They need a resurgence in their profile and in the community. So similar to poker, and poker was a great example, right? It was basically a lot of degenerates, and maybe today it still is, but it's glorified, right? It became a national sport.
Yeah, it's on TV.
We think that the same thing will happen, right? So by blurring the line between spectator and owner, we're giving access, we're democratizing the game of kings to the average person.
I want to cheat a little bit. I want to skip ahead for a minute. Do I need to have an avatar to be able to buy land or to be able to buy?
You don't.
Okay.
You don't. The only reason you need an avatar is if you own a horse, and if you own a horse directly. If you're a syndicator, if you're a limited partner, you don't need a silk.
And then on the other side of the fence, do you have anti-monopoly thoughts in your mind? Do you have that you can't corner the market, so to speak?
It's interesting. I've never been asked that question, so I don't have a good answer for you, in all honesty. I think that having a website that aggregates the industry is not a monopoly. I think that there are a lot of ways to bet on horses. We're still competing with the real world. But we're competing with a world where people aren't showing up at the tracks as much anymore,
right?
And the younger generation is really not into the sport. And I can tell you, when you go to our Discord, and our Discord is growing organically by hundreds of users a day. This has been in stealth mode for a year. We launched to the public our social channels 18 days ago, I think today. We're approaching 10,000 people on Discord, and these are all people. It's a mix of horse people, and it's a mix of crypto people that want to get in the game. And so we see a tremendous amount of interest in this category. And we're not the first ones to enter the metaverse, or to at least enter horse racing as a category with NFTs. There's a famous project called Zedrun, which came out about a year and a half ago, that offers a game that has nothing to do with us, but it's themed in horse racing.
Yeah.
Right? They offer it's a betting game. It's a player versus player betting game. It operates very similar to a sit and go poker tournament, where you can buy a horse. It's a digital fictional horse that has a fictional bloodline, and you can enter it into a race against 11 other people. And when 12 people sign up for the race, then they pull a slot machine, and an algorithm determines who's going to win. And then they animate the race, and whoever wins gets the pot.
Yeah.
That has nothing to do with us, but they've sold hundreds of millions of dollars worth of fake horses in the form of NFTs, and have a vibrant community. So, and there are about a dozen copycats to them. So there's definitely an interest in this category. And by bringing the real world of horse racing to the metaverse, I think we're going to see tremendous adoption.
Dan,
Dan,
you
I'm
mentioned
gonna.
that.
Oh, I'm
Go
sorry.
ahead, go ahead,
I
Jay.
just want to kind of go like a few steps back. Where did like? Are you an avid, fan of horse racing, or where did this come from? Because clearly, the fantasy thought of what you're doing is incredible idea, and clearly there's a lot of thought has gone into this. Why did you choose horse racing?
So it's a great question. I didn't choose horse racing. I chose. I'm a big fantasy guy. I've been involved in fantasy for a long time, both as a consumer and as a professional. Um, I was introduced to somebody, to the CEO of a company called Tropical Racing, which is a public uh, a horse farm that breeds, syndicates races, um, and by a prior investor of mine. And they were trying to figure out a strategy to get into NFTs. And through that introduction, I learned a lot about the industry, and ultimately became that company became our lead investor in our first seed round. And that's how I learned about the industry. And what really got me excited about this space was how perfectly it fits into metaverse and NFTs and Web 3.0. And the reasons for that is, one, you have a sport where I can build a community around a one-to-one relationship between a person and a competitor. You can't do that in a traditional sport. At the Crown League, when we were building our game, the way we created communities was to build collectively owned teams, right? You could have 10,000 people that own a fantasy team. In But you can't do one to one. I can't own Tom Brady because there aren't enough people to create a vibrant community. With 20,000 rookies coming into this game a year, I can build a vibrant community. And then if I can create small shared communities, micro communities, all of a sudden I can introduce 200,000 new people to the game a year and build a community of millions of people. That's one. Two, horses have longevity. So you're creating an NFT that has a life cycle that can be 25 or 30 years, right? You can buy an NFT that literally has utility for 30 years. That doesn't exist today
Okay,
in a
so
game.
now I've got to ask the question. I apologize for derailing it. I've been to two horse races in my life, and on one of those they had to bring out the curtain, and the horse went off to the glue factory. Is there a metric for that happening here? If it happens in real life, like it happens
I think
in
that's going to be the
silks?
name of my stable, is Glue Factory.
The glue
Is glue
factory.
factory? The answer is yes.
Okay.
Everything that happens in the real world happens here. Now, interestingly enough, since you brought it up, the only time a horse is reported to die is if it happens on the track. That's the rule. If it doesn't happen on the track, there's really no way of knowing it unless it's public, unless it's a famous horse. And therefore, we have an algorithm that tracks productivity. If after a certain period of time a horse hasn't been scheduled to race and hasn't published breeding data, we deem that horse to be retired. And in that case, we're going to create a section of the metaverse where we create utility for those horses in the form of fictional games where you can race your horse in a similar type of manner where you can do it today
Off to
in
pasture.
Zedrun or
And that's where I'm going to dominate, Jay. All my retirement. The Glue Factory stable is going to come after me.
Yes.
So again, and I asked the question because there's so many facets to this, because you're tying into real life. You're not just saying, here's 20,000 randomly generated horses with 100,000 randomly generated traits. It's a one-to-one representation of a horse, and then there's so much of this data that's flowing in. How do you
Yeah.
how are you filtering and ensuring the data is correct?
Okay. So that's a great question. So one, this data is publicly available in thousands of locations. So you can find that data on racetrack websites. You can find the data in public databases that are sponsored by the registrar. You can find it on handicapping sites. You can find it in newspapers. Many, many sources of data. We're going to acquire that data multiple ways. We're going to acquire the data through oracles that go out and grab the data from public sites. And we're also going to acquire the data through the community. So part of our model is to incentivize the community to go out there and validate the data. So for example, when there's a race that takes place, that data is publicly available, the results of that data. If 20 people from our community go out and get that data and populate that data in our databases, through consensus and staking and proof of stake, we can validate that data and then use that data to settle the contests. So if your horse came in second in the third race at Churchill Downs, and our community validates that data as truth, we can now release a payment of tokens to you as a reward. That is a truly decentralized way to operate this platform. We don't rely on it, but if we ever want it to be completely decentralized, we could be. And that also provides an opportunity similar to Axie Infinity, where instead of paying people to play games, we're paying people to actually build databases, and creating economies and jobs in third world countries. That's never been done before. So imagine crowdsourcing databases that are worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And over time, our databases will have incredible, incredible utility, both in our game and for the real world. We're also leveraging the value of, of data that exists in the real world, which is 100% relevant to what we're doing. So when you research your horse that you acquired in a drop, you're using public data to tell you the value of that horse. I'm not going to get into the detail of prices, but this is how the DAO generates income and how we're able to replicate the economy. So each year we release a collection of avatars that give people the opportunity to create an identity within the metaverse. Each year we drop a collection of yearlings that are tokenized from the real world horses. Each year
Is that a single drop, or is that layered out over the year?
As it is right now, it's going to be scheduled as a single drop.
Okay.
Yeah, so the horses typically are sold in a very tight time frame as yearlings, and we're going to sell the horses and time the drop right around the time of the real auctions.
Interesting. Okay.
Land and stables and other structures, you'll be able to build out estates, trick them out, and we'll build collections similar to the way Star Atlas does with their spaceships, for those of you that are familiar with their collections. So that's a revenue stream. And then obviously every time our assets are traded, we receive royalties. The DAO receives royalties. The affiliate marketing line is the line that's generated from the pushing of bets to the tracks and receiving a royalty for that, or an affiliate marketing fee for that. We think there's an opportunity in developing assets for companies and advertising and sponsorship. And then finally, we're going to stake the DAO. So it will create yield for the community. And what you can see, and the reason I wanted to show you this slide, is the real world of horse racing generates about $1 billion in prize money a year. And when we can get to that point of creating $1 billion of inflow into the DAO, we can distribute tokens that are backed by that same inflow without diluting the value of the DAO. And so we believe, based on our current projections, that it will take somewhere between 6 and 7 years for the market to pay for horses in an NFT drop at a level equal to what the real horses sell for in real life, and therefore create enough inflows to be able to distribute tokens that reward you in the same way, where there's an economic indifference between whether your horse is real or whether your horse is virtual. So when your horse races and wins $1 million in the real world, you're winning the equivalent of $1 million in our world.
So I'm going to get a real horse, and it's going to be named Economic Indifference. I love it. The names are they're coming right to me in this podcast. It's amazing.
So anyhow, I wanted to show this to you because literally it's going to take us about 7 years to reach parity with the real world economy.
No, I love it. So I'm going to bring it in and kind of we'll move through to close here because I've got a couple more questions. The thing that's so amazing to me about what you've done with Silks is you haven't even launched, and the complexity but simplicity of what you're doing is fabulous. We see a lot of time like Axie Infinity. We know what they do. It's a simplistically stupid game of which I couldn't,
and not a lot of fun.
I couldn't get into it, but it was very much. There is hundreds of thousands of people around the world that are playing this game and earning a living. Again, these are not people in the United States or in first world countries, but in third world countries that are making a living doing what is again would to most people would be like a little game they play for 5 minutes. I think the economics and tokenomics that you're rolling out here in Silks will absolutely bring a different level and a higher level of earning capability to those parts of the world, and also probably parts of the world that have no idea what horse racing is. And so a little bit of exposure to this class.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the ideas that we've developed within this marketplace, within this metaverse, promotes a variety of things that have never been seen before. The establishment of micro communities, the establishment of crowdsourced databases, the development of crowdsourced database, the ability to invest in gaming assets that have very long-term utility. All of these things have never really been done before. The ability to actually parallel a real economy um, and create parity with it. I think we'll see more of that. Um, I think we'll see incredible ideas come about where you'll be able to essentially replicate economies. In fact, that's part of our vision and mission. So I'm being maniacally focused on this vertical because we want to get this right. It's too big of an opportunity, but there are dozens of verticals where you could apply very similar um, create similar parallel economies and gamify them. And
What's the UI going to be? Is it going to be an app on your phone? Is it going to be a VR thing? How will people visually see all of this that you're talking about?
so you're going to see it if you look at the video of the trailer that you can show to the group at some point, or visit our website at silks.io. You can watch and see a little bit of the metaverse. The end of that video shows an actual race um, at an iconic racetrack. That's what it's going to look like.
Okay.
You literally will be walking into every stadium, every track in eventually the world, and be able to experience it that way. The UI will have buttons that give you functionality. You'll be able to walk into a stable, somebody's stable, and let's say it's a 10 acre, 10 horse farm. You'll be able to interact with the horses. Your NFT is a living, breathing, three-dimensional creature. You, as the owner, because your wallet has that horse in it, it will know that you're the owner. And when you approach that horse, it will interact with you differently than if the public visits and approaches the horse. And you'll be able to do all kinds of things with that horse. You'll be able to feed it. You'll be able to take it out of its stable. You'll be able to run it on a training track. You'll be able to do a lot of things that create emotional connectivity between you and this three-dimensional digital virtual asset. The public will be able to learn about every horse in your stable by walking up to the stable. They'll be able to see trophies. They'll be able to see their earnings. They'll be able to see their performance. They'll be able to buy your horse right out of your stable if they want to, because your horse will be connected to the marketplace. So lots of really cool ways, very intuitive ways to interact. When your horse is racing, it'll disappear from your stable and it'll appear at the racetrack, and you'll be notified of it. As will the rest of the community. There will be structures like there will be a Hall of Fame where the top stables are displayed there. The top horses are displayed, draped with their silks, and really cool interactive experiences to educate. A lot of this is about education. When you play fantasy sports, you have to learn about the players, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there are tons of third-party websites that provide you and sell you content to help you better manage your team and your trade, acquire, etc. In our game, it's the same thing, right? You're going to want to learn everything about every relevant horse that's out there, and that's going to give you the advantages, because this is a game of skill at the end of the day.
Dan, I got to tell you, I'm really impressed. I'm excited to see how it goes. Your drops in when? 4 weeks?
4 weeks. I think we haven't published the date, but by the time this comes out, will be published. I think that the whitelist is April 27th.
Okay.
And then very shortly thereafter, within a day or two, is going to be early access and then the public sale.
I'm super
to be clear, you buy an avatar if you're whitelisted and you buy a horse, so it's 2 transactions?
It's 2 transactions. So you buy an avatar that makes you a member of the community and owner of the platform, and a stakeholder. And that gives you your identity, and it also gives you a mint pass. I don't think we're going to have a public sale for the horses. I think that what will happen is it's going to be a closed community to start with, and then the secondary market will develop. So if you want to buy a horse in the drop, you'll probably have to buy an avatar in the secondary market. You certainly will, actually.
Amazing. Yeah. Dan, what's the best way for people to learn more? Silks.io and where are you hanging out at?
Yeah, so silks.io, I would encourage you to download the white paper, which is very informative. I would encourage you to join the Discord, which is hyperactive, and get on the whitelist through Discord. And you can also register for early access. So after our whitelist sells out, we're going to carve out a bulk of the availability of our avatars to early access members. So you can connect your wallet now. I can tell you that we're again, 18 days into this, we're a third of the way sold out, and I think it's going to go in the next 10 or 15 days. So encourage people, if they like the concept and you want to be a part of this, to get involved.
Dan, thank you so much for swinging by. Mike, thank you so much for co-hosting yWhales. And for everyone else, that's Silks. And we'll have you back on, Dan, a little bit after launch. We'll hear how it's going. Don't go anywhere, but thank you guys.